So this is 08:25 hours GMT and 8:25 in the morning in London, local time. This is part A of today's KhoodeelaarTV online, broadcasting online on the internet only, not on satellite or on terrestrial or on cable. Now, this is a unique world exclusive daily diagnosis or a series of daily diagnoses of the newspapers called Fleet Street collectively. And in doing the diagnosis, we also diagnose the state of the corruption and darkness and decadence in the so-called British politics, parliament, the judiciary, the whole lot. Now, in the front page of the Financial Times today, which says it won't publish tomorrow because it's Good Friday, today's price of Financial Times is £2.90 UK. And in the Channel Islands is £3.20 and the Republic of Ireland £3.20. So this is obviously a London-based or UK-based operation. The FT must have operations elsewhere in the world, especially probably in Singapore and other places. So one of the three kind of banners is about new era of sleaze. Boris Johnson's misdeeds leave David Cameron in the shade. Now, I've of course added both first names, but to many people who are not in Britain, Johnson and Cameron may not immediately be recognizable. And there is a piece inside the paper which is mentioned in the briefing column that, and it uses the correct word, campaigners. Campaigners reject race equality report. Now, it's not race equality report at all. It's the Munira Mirza and Tony Sewell, two coconuts. Tony Sewell is of Jamaican, I think, background. So, well, Jamaican, through Jamaica, let's say Caribbean, and he's African origin. And he's very black-skinned, as I have to say, because the blackness, when he appears, the blackness draws attention to the point that it actually distracts attention from the real coconut service that he performs, because it creates the wrong impression that if a black-skinned person can appreciate racism and glorify slavery, then there is nothing wrong with racism and nothing wrong with slavery. That's the reason why it's important to point out how black he is. And the blacker he is, the more servile he is and the more kind of hostile to a moral requirement he is. And Munira Mirza is of Pakistani origin, like Sajid Javid and a few others who are in the Conservative Party with Pakistani origins, Conservative Party or conservative kind of causes or ideology. It is Sajid Javid who was, for a brief period, in post as the UK's Interior Minister. The Home Secretary is not understood as Interior Minister in the rest of the world unless they're part of the narrative of brainwashing. And what Sajid Javid did was like the dream job, the dream task for all racists and anti-Muslims and Muslim phobes, as they say, anti-Muslims, when he took away the citizenship from Nasima Begum, while at the same time complaining wrongly and without any justification whatsoever that he was being wrongly taunted by, he called the left in Britain. That is, he meant the white people who are supposedly against racism. And he complained that he was being trolled and attacked and condemned as being a coconut. And in reply to that, I spoke at a public event, not a large crowd present, but a public event held at the very spot where I spoke to London Weekend Television for the Sunday program, the Sunday show, fronted by Jenner Street Porter in May 1978. That was the first ever known direct television statement made on behalf of the victims of racist attacks and murders, and most certainly on behalf of the Bangladeshis. And I spoke very briefly, and it was included in the actual broadcast. And I said to Sajid Javid, all these years later, nearly 38 years, 40 years later, that if he thought that he was being wrongly, unfairly called a coconut, then he should not behave as a coconut. Because the only reason why he was being called a coconut was because of his coconut behavior. Now that was, I think, before he took away the British citizenship by birth from Shamima Begum. So the item about campaigners rejecting race equality report that is detailed on page 2 and page 10 of the Financial Times of today. I mean, it is ill-informed, but it is, the fact is being recorded. The fact that campaigners against racism are condemning the racist report by Boris Johnson, which has been fronted by Tony Sewell and Munira Mirza. One of the consequences of the racists in the NUJ, or the NUJ racists involved in the East End News in 1981, when they plotted to divert attention from my hostility and opposition to racism at the East End News, based at the Victoria Park Square in 1981, was to create a degenerate kind of diversion. And that diversion is known as the Voice newspaper today. I have already spoken about its origin and details, but essentially the basic fact is that when I was on the editorial board of the East End News in 1981, I had constant battle with the racists, fronted by a racist called Mike Jameson. That criminal and his co-racist criminals forever waged a war against me because I was telling them to stop being racist. And those criminals created a page on the Eastern News. And they invited a complete stranger, because he was not a journalist and he was not locally based or had any intellectual content whatsoever. This was called Val McKellar. And they gave him a name and a page where they allowed absolute racist lies, just like the denials of Boris Johnson, as published in the last 48 hours. And eventually Val McKellar used or was aided and abetted to use that kind of reference to get the then apartheid funding Barclays Bank and others, to give him funding to launch the Vice weekly newspaper. And from that moment on, the Vice newspaper has been completely stupid and pro-racist and absolutely servile. So this is 40 years. So Tony Sewell was given a platform where he did what he has done in the last 48 hours. He denied there was racism in this country and that the black community, which was the victim of the racists at various levels, was to blame for racism. Essentially, that was the line. And the Vice newspaper remains as confused and stupid and sunk in ignorance, in servility to racist masters and mistresses 40 years on. And it completely failed to capture, gather, understand, recognize the details or the actual extent or the actual identity of the various racist strategies of the last 40 years. As I said, I knew Alex Pascal and Robert Govinda. Now, I don't know whether Pascal is unwell or not, but I haven't heard from him for a long time, since I met him 10 years ago, chance encounter at a court counter, Clerkenwell, Shoreditch County Court. And he promised to respond properly, and he hasn't. And I've discussed his role and Robert Govinda's role same year, 1981, at the weekend conference about racism that I had organized. Well, I had mobilized and prevailed upon the racist conspiracy court's Commission for Racial Equality. And I left the principal subservient to racism, Lionel Morrison. I left him hardly any choice but to organize the conference that I had asked him to do. Of course, the conference purpose that I had been wanting to have advocated and established were significantly sabotaged by Lionel Morrison and the others, with the complicity of the likes of Alex Pascal and Robert Govinda colluding with Lionel Morrison. So the theme about newspapers and media in Britain of the last half a century is that it is racist, and it is racist and racistly aided and abetted by the likes of the Vice and the Val McKellar, Alex Pascal, Robert Govinda et al. And this thesis, this analysis extrapolates and applies to the whole world, including the USA, North America, the South American countries, and right across Africa and Asia. So anyone who is watching this for the first time needs to know that this is the summary, the very brief statement behind this program and behind the description of it as the world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. And at the same time that I do the diagnosis of Fleet Street papers, literally like this Financial Times today, I also do the diagnosis of the unseen forces behind the contents and the role of the Fleet Street papers. For example, today's paper continue some sort of reference to David Cameron's sleazy role. But I have been saying for 10 years, since Cameron took office as the so-called Prime Minister in May 2011. But I had been diagnostically drawing attention to his racism and his stupidity and his corruption and dishonesty since he became leader of the opposition Conservatives. And today the Financial Times is the only paper that is running this kind of item, which is that Johnson's misdeeds leave Cameron in the shade. There is no such article in any other title, not even in The Guardian, which is detailing some of the evidential exposure of the corrupt David Cameron and the misconducting Boris Johnson. But this headline is not to be found anywhere else in the Fleet Street titles. Johnson's misdeeds leave Cameron in the shade, which says that Johnson is the worst wrongdoer in comparison with Cameron. But that comparison should not be made. The comparison should be made on objective grounds, not by relating Cameron to Johnson and vice versa. Because the unfitness for purpose of Boris Johnson is a detriment, daily detriment to the whole society. It doesn't matter whether he is a worse wrongdoer than Cameron. The fact that he is in post and is doing any wrongs is bad enough, is the serious actual wrong. And the Financial Times should not be comparing those two. The Financial Times, anyone else who is talking about this or will talk about this, should be focusing attention on the evidence of their detrimental roles and policies and behavior and narrative against the whole society, first of all, and secondly, against the many, to take a phrase. So here, in the actual piece, this writer, Henry Mance, M-A-N-C-E, has got this heading, Politics Morphs from Delusion into Sleaze. Well, this is a kind of inadequate heading. And the inadequacy continues throughout the piece. And it ends with the paragraph, politicians like Johnson and Jenrick may judge that the odds of getting away with sleaze are high. But are they high enough? I wonder what Cameron thinks about that. In future, few people will ask what Cameron thinks about anything, because sadly, he has shredded his reputation. He should be a cautionary tale. And there is a highlighted part of this article, which says former prime ministers earn enough for speeches to banks. They should not have to speak for them too. Now, when he says that Cameron has shredded his reputation, he is being coy himself, because he's not talking about the absence, institutional and real and parliamentary absence of accountability or holding wrongdoing politicians to account. And he's not talking about the judicial system being absent. And he's not talking about the academic world being completely tame and stupid and servile to the crooks in politics and in business. And he's not talking about the culture of criminality that dominates big business, etc. And he's not talking, most certainly is not talking about the deadly, useless Crown Prosecution Service, and the undemocratic and completely unauthorized scrapping of so many crimes by the police without having to answer to Parliament or anyone. So when I said earlier this week that Britain is a banana republic, that is the kind of thing that I meant, and I included. Now, the banana republic image means that there is no due process, there is no law, there is nothing. And this is dangerous. Because if there is no law, there is no accountability, there is no answerability, then it is going back not 100 years or 200 years, it's going back thousands of years. That is why it is so important to look for evidence of any sign that anyone, no matter how small the number, anyone is even bothered about realizing this. What I represent in this commentary and diagnosis is not represented by any of these single writers, including this man's in the Financial Times, who is comparing Johnson with Cameron and vice versa. So this is part of the movement. This has been part of the movement, a moral, ethical, democratic, and international movement that I have been advocating. That you must focus on the liars and the lying. It may sound simple, but lying is at the heart of the big crimes and criminality. Everything is based on lies and lying. And I have been campaigning against liars and lying right from the word go, when I started campaigning against liars and lying. Transcending, that is to say, regardless of what origin, ethnic, religious, gender, race, whatever, of the liars and the lying. It is the lies and the lying and the denials that actually destroy rights, recognition, equality, fairness, access, and everything else that society is supposedly made up and stands on. And society includes society regionally, locally, centrally, so-called nationally and internationally. We shall go back to discussing more about Cameron and Johnson, but let's look at this lunatic stupidity by this criminality personified in Murdoch. I mean, every day they have an excuse to overhype and overpromote Brenda. And here is the sickness of the parade. The scum says nation's COVID boost, and it is claiming that that is nation's boost because Brenda has taken a second vaccine. How do they translate that as nation's boost? I mean, it's only her. How does it boost anyone else? And then they're celebrating the fact that she is not wearing a mask. That's brazen. And then it claims that 99% take up dose number 2. And they're pathetically, embarrassingly, stupidly running the splash jabs mommy. Remember, I call the 52% the gullibles, and I relate that percentage to the Brexit exhibition. But it could go back decades, and you could find the similar kind of proportion of the gullibles, that is the most stupid of the population. And they're appealing to that part of the population. It's embarrassing. But and yesterday, this come published on the front page a kind of conversation between two mixed race black sports persons. And then on the editorial, it denied there was racism in this country. And today it says the tech giants own goal on racism. So it's lying on every kind of occasion. And there is another black-skinned person surprisingly found as a wise, thoughtful commentator to deny racism and support the denier of racism, Boris Johnson. And it's a unheard of person called Marcy Muroki. They're using her to run this complete, absolute racist piece of denial. Yes, there is racism, but inequality harms people of every color. Now, that is complete and utter stupidity. It's the context. And the context is that racists target black people, and the targeted black people are the ones who suffer inequality. It's not the racists who suffer inequality as well, which is what they are saying. And there is relentless lying and bias and criminality, because although the police attacked the women, peaceful women, mourners for Sarah Everard, saying that the women were breaking the COVID restrictions, they made an exception about Kate Middleton. They're saying that she too visited the vigil, but her visit was legal. This is like the opposite of what they do to Meghan Markle. They would find any excuse to damn her and find her at fault at anything she does, no matter how purely selfless and moral Meghan's work may be. And the opposite, they do the opposite. When Kate Middleton visited in the same afternoon when other women were attacked by the police, they are now saying, and the scum is actually magnifying that claim, that Kate Middleton's visit was perfectly legal. And the same line that the racists are kind of peddling around the racist report denying racism is being repeated by Rod Little. He says, or he claims, proof, finally, that lines are dividing us are not race, but class. What does he know? Anyone writing for Rupert Murdoch must be assumed to be a liar, because that's what Murdoch's scam is, and that's what all the Murdoch enterprise is, festering in lying, dishonesty, racism, corruption, and hatred. Now, Murdoch, of course, owns both the Times and the scum. But it's like kind of the narrative is the same. Denial of racism, denial of every colonial kind of misdeeds and wrongs, an anti-democratic kind of thing that Johnson and Cameron et al. Promote and profit from. But the Times actually operates with a different kind of linguistic approach that is not so obviously corrupt and racist. So, for example, this one is about the same report by the same racists are being report of denial by Munira Mirza and Tony Sewell. And this is saying that critics of that report have focused on the fact that that report glorifies racism. That is what is in the copy. It's not in the headline, because the headline could be interpreted as being supportive of the lying report. But it's not. And you have to read the actual copy underneath that heading. Anger over slave claims in landmark race review. Now that is a lie. It's not a landmark race at all. And we shall be fact-checking the contents just so that we are not missing anything that is accidentally there, which is acceptable. There is nothing acceptable in that report. So let's release this first paragraph. The government's race review has been condemned as culturally deaf after it stated there was a new story to be told about slavery, which is not just about profit and suffering. The report by the Independent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, that is a complete crass lie. It's a Downing Street statement. It's not independent at all. Formed last July after the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter. Remember, it was to counter the Black Lives Matter, arguing that the era was also about how culturally African people transformed themselves. So that's a lie. That's a pack of lies. Even by the Times doing the misleading lure of a report that doesn't sound like the scum. And the top of the page 1 of the Times has this piece: Helpline for Pupils as ministers launch school sex abuse inquiry. Now that is stupid as hell, because the school should be properly monitored, every school, by Ofsted, number one. And number two, locally, every school should have a really rigorous, demanding, alert governing body. Remember what I said about the Stratford Government School, and the campaign I launched to defend the parent governors in January 1992. And I ran this particular dedicated campaign up to May 1992. And the lessons are absolutely unique. The governors of the secondary schools, mainly, let's say, because the secondary schools are the ones that are more in the news due to the allegations about sex and rape culture, sexual harassment and rape culture dominating all these schools. Both the so-called fee-paying private schools and also the so-called state sector schools, what is also called these are also known as the comprehensive schools. My engagement with the schools head teachers has shown that every single head teacher that I've encountered, since over 5 decades in the UK, every single head teacher is on the run. Whenever I am approaching them with series of questions, they are on the run. And now why should they have to kind of run? Because they cannot answer the questions without also coming across as being corrupt, anti-educational, anti-enlightenment, and anti-society, anti-social. As I said earlier this week, because of that, in my count, I have had to take action against at least 12 separate, of course, head teachers in various schools in Tower Hamlets. And I had to persuade them to resign or be sacked or whatever. Think about that. 12 head teachers, getting them to leave their jobs because they were too bad for the schools, too bad for the children, and too bad for any program of schooling that was supposedly to prepare the children for the next stages of their lives. So when I say that I started a campaign against Tower Hamlets Council because it failed the safeguarding duty against wrongs being kind of imposed or done to children in Tower Hamlets, I didn't just come up with that campaign. That is what I have been doing. I had been doing all the time. And the vocabulary, the phrasing, and the analysis that I'm using this week, let's say, or in the last month, these are not new. I have been using the same phrases and analysis and the same evidential trails for decades. Is there anyone else doing the same? No. Why? Because they don't want to lose their benefits, their advantage, their careers, their access, their spot as colluders with the particular regime in the given school or regimes in the given schools when it involves several people that we are talking about. Now, every life destroyed in terms of housing, employment, personal life, etc., in the last 40 years, let's say 50 years, in a place like Tower Hamlets, you can trace the loss and the damage done to that life and link it to the school. Of course, school plus home, plus the rest of society, plus the street aspect of the community. But a systematic kind of engagement in the school or engagement away from the school is crucial. So when I say the Townless Council has negligently betrayed these 4 schoolgirls from Bethnal Green, I'm also remembering literally hundreds of other children that the schools have betrayed and let down and have been allowed, the schools have been allowed to do that by the local education authority, whether it was the Inner London Education Authority or since the late 1980s, the local council as the local education authority in the case of London. So the culture of sleaze, misdeeds, wrongdoing that has been described as the culture of Boris Johnson and David Cameron is also the culture in the schools and in the local council. Think about that. So here they say that helpline for pupils as ministers launch school sex abuse inquiry. As I said, this is a lie because sex abuse in the schools have been present, ongoing, especially where schools have had children, girls as children, as pupils. And as the kind of pervasive incidents of rape every day in this country shows, rape is an accepted culture in Britain. I'm saying it again. Rape is an accepted culture in Britain. Despite the slogans to the contrary, despite the expressions of outrage by many in Fleet Street, rape is allowed and rape is tolerated. Rape is, in fact, encouraged. That is rape. And on top of the rape, there are violent sexual assaults, violent sexual harassments that are allowed as well. And as I said, in the case of the so-called ethnicity-linked communities, say like the Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets, I have said, and I'm saying it again, because of the negligent and corrupt and criminally uncaring culture in the local council, many girls in families, in Bangladeshi families, are being sexually exploited, sexually harassed, even raped by members of their own families. Many of them, their relations, including their parents. Children are being sexually abused in Tower Hamlets. Quite apart from and separately from the lack of safeguarding duties neglected about the 4 girls from the Bethnal Green area school, Tower Hamlets Council is colluding, knowingly colluding with abuses of children and girls in particular, and of vulnerable women in Tower Hamlets. And talking about all of this at a time when there is supposed to be a campaign going on to change the structure of administration in a council from one with an elected mayor to one where the leader leads the group of councillors, controlling group of councillors. We have to say this, that even if the elected mayor system is ditched and ended, even if the elected mayor system is ditched and ended, there will still be very serious and severe cases for demanding rigorous accountability from the counselors and the leader-led kind of group. We shall be talking more about this in the next part.